Okay, so this is a short presentation. We're going to talk about some tips in talking about the God question with people. I found over the years that one of the most important questions you can ask to people when they're throwing objections at you or asking you questions is ask a clarifying question called, "What do you mean by that?" And I will expand on this in a few areas, and you'll see what I'm talking about as we move forward here. So let's say someone comes to you and they say that they don't think there's any evidence or proof for God. Of course, you can respond to them by saying, "What do you mean by evidence or proof?" That is certainly a lot easier than simply rambling off some argument in front of them, which you can't explain very well, or something that they have no interest in. And so when someone comes to you and says, there's no proof for God, there's no evidence for God, or we can't know, or I just don't know how to know if there is a God, or that Jesus is a son of God, it's an agnostic there, you can respond to them by asking them a clarifying question. What do you mean by evidence or proof? Because if you look at this chart here, if anything that my experience shows me, probably about 90% of the time, most people have not taken an intro to logic class. I mean, I'm not trying to be insulting. I'm just saying that a lot of people don't know these terms, and I didn't know them either, obviously, before I looked into it. But the point is that a lot of people don't know that when you're talking about proof, obviously, when it comes to logic, there are things called induction and deduction and abduction, and a lot of people aren't familiar with these categories. And so I always ask them, what do they mean by proof or evidence? And then I ask them if they're familiar with these three things, because you can always come back to them with some of these questions I have here on the chart. Of course, you can ask them also, does proof or evidence mean to have no possible counterarguments or to have 100% certainty? That's something I say on the third point down here. I can always ask them, or I ask them, does proof or evidence mean to have certitude? That means beyond doubt, where every question is answered exhaustively and you have absolute certitude. Obviously, you don't get that much with anything except maybe math. And of course, I ask, does proof or evidence mean you have to have exhaustive knowledge? And I always challenge them on the very bottom here. If you look at the one side, the very bottom corner here, I always ask them what level of certainty they had before they made a large commitment in life, such as taking a job or getting married, or maybe another commitment. I asked them how much certainty they had, or how many unanswered questions did they have, or what kind of gaps of knowledge did they have, because most of the time we always have to commit with some gaps of knowledge. And on the right side here, you'll notice when it comes to induction, induction is based on observation experience. Of course, that's what we do in history and science, and we do that with the resurrection of Jesus because we're arguing from effect to cause. And inductive arguments only offer probable support or high degrees of probability, but not absolute certainty. Of course, that's the way it is with science as well. When it comes to deduction, that is proof that is prior to experience, and that's something that we do with rational demonstration for God's existence, such as Edward Fazer's book, 5 Proofs for the Existence of God, or some sort of Thomistic argument, or we get into philosophical arguments, we're doing a lot of deductive proofs. When it comes to abductive proof or abductive evidence, that is something that's used in cold case investigations in science and history. Those are things that people did not observe directly, similar to induction. And we can agree on certain features of reality, then ask what explains that feature of reality. What is the best explanation for that feature of reality? And that's what we do with abductive evidence. So you can bring those things up, just ask them if they're familiar with those three words, because if they're not familiar with it, I could say, well, I can give you an inductive case for the resurrection of Jesus, or an abductive case for some design arguments, or an abductive case for Jesus' resurrection as well. Those are different kinds of proofs. And then the very bottom here on the right, of course, we talk about direct evidence and circumstantial or indirect evidence. Nobody has direct evidence for a lot of things in the past. They weren't there to see them, even in the sciences. And so we have to come up with the best explanation based on indirect evidence. That's the way it is. That's called circumstantial indirect evidence. We do that in history and cold case investigations. So you may just want to clarify terms with people and bring these things up and see if they're familiar with them. It might get them to think a little further on the issue and help them. Another thing that comes up here, this is similar to what I was just saying about the indirect evidence issue. Of course, the goal is to arrive beyond a reasonable doubt. Happens in cold case investigations with detectives. But another thing that comes up as well is the issue of God. When someone says that they don't believe in God, there's no evidence for God, there's no proof for God, I always ask them what they mean by God. That's very helpful. Because a lot of people, if they've not read the Bible or they've not really studied anything about theology, they may just assume in their mind, they're making a judgment on God based on something they've come up with in their mind or in the cultural views of God, such as God is just an old man in the sky with a beard or like a stern wizard. Obviously there's all kinds of caricatures of God in the culture around us. And so you always want to clarify, what do they mean by God when they say there's no God, or I don't know if God exists. Get them to define what they mean by God, or try to get them to define it. Because the God of the Bible, as we know through the natural world and through historical revelation, this is the God that we're talking about, the biblical God, some of the features of the biblical God. And so most of the time, many people don't know that's what we mean by God, but obviously you can point this out to them. And so it just really helps to say, this is the God I'm talking about that I follow, that I think is real and based in reality. This God is triune. He's self-existent. He's a necessary being. He's eternal. He's unchangeable, immutable. Some of these other attributes, and you can talk about these things. Now, granted, someone may say, well, how would you know that? And you might say, well, obviously in the Bible, God reveals his moral attributes, but his non-moral attributes can be revealed through the natural world, or what's called natural theology. You don't need the Bible to know some of these attributes up here, like necessity and self-existence and eternality and immateriality and unchangeability. Those things are revealed in the natural world, meaning you don't have to open the Bible to know those things. So you just have to clarify that with people. But obviously, it may be up to you to show these things are true, but the point is that that is the God we're talking about. And that means that when people expect God to be like a table or a chair or a car, meaning that they can see God, he's a physical being with parts and composition, and they always ask questions like, what caused God, or where did God come from? They're assuming God is a physical, material thing, that God is a thing, and God is not a thing. And so they're just very confused about the nature of God, of what God is. And so once we talk about what God is and the God we're trying to talk about, that will lead us to know how to show God exists. And this is where, basic theology is very important, and also some general philosophy as well. But people make the mistake of assuming God needs to fit in one of these categories, like he's a physical thing, something that can be verified directly with our five senses. But that is not what we're talking about when we're trying to show or talk about God exists. And of course, we have the issue of science that comes up a lot. For example, atheist Alex Rosenberg says in his book, The Atheist Guide to Reality, that the predictive power and technological applications of science are unparalleled by those of any other purported source of knowledge. Therefore, what science reveals to us is probably all that is real. So he's really trying to make a case that science is the only way of knowing things, and that leads us to ask the question, what do you mean by science, and what kind of science should demonstrate the existence or non-existence of God? Because really, you're talking about sciences. We need to ask about sciences. What branch of science? You have the natural or physical sciences, such as physics, chemistry, biology, geology, astronomy. You have the social sciences, such as linguistics, textual hermeneutics, anthropology, and sociology. And of course, you have the mathematical and logical sciences, such as engineering, computer science, and theoretical math. So I always ask people, what do you mean by science? And what kind of science? What branch of science should show that God exists? And so when you look at these definitions by what do you mean by science, look at a couple of them here. Jeffrey Burton Russell says, here, science defines itself by its effort to explain the physical world of matter and energy. And then another definition here says science is the attempted objective study of the natural world or natural phenomena whose theories and explanations do not normally depart from the natural realm. So you notice here that science is really a study of the natural and physical world. Well, if that's the case, then, and what Rosenberg is talking about, then we need to ask ourselves, how would science prove or show the existence of non-existence of God? As we'll look at the next slide, because as we know, if science only studies the physical material world, the analogy would be that metal detectors are obviously only going to reveal us things that are metallic, right? Because that's what it's designed to do. And so we need to ask ourselves, can a metal detector find a piece of rubber? Well, probably not, but it doesn't mean rubber doesn't exist. And so science is really restricted to study the physical and natural realm. Therefore, is God natural or non-natural? Is God physical? How would science prove or provide evidence against the non-existence of God? So you need to clarify with people what they mean by science and what they mean by God, of course, and also what kind of branch of science, what branch of science would give evidence for God or the non-existence of God. And then, of course, remember that science only deals with impersonal objects and the laws of nature. It does not deal with personal explanations. Obviously, all around us every day, we observe personal and agent explanations where we have minds making choices. There's motive, will, intention, and there's a goal, right? And so reality isn't restricted only to scientific explanations because that's only dealing with the impersonal laws of nature. But obviously, reality is filled with agent explanations as well. So those are some things to think about when you talk to people, because a lot of times they don't know what they mean when they make these claims. There's no evidence for proof for God. They don't know what they mean by God, and they're not really clear on what they mean by science and what science can and can't do. So I hope this helps you with your outreach, and it's a little tip to use, but always ask people, what do you mean by that? Have a good day.